Let me talk about the commons as a new and old form of governance. And I think it's really new only in the sense that it's being culturally rediscovered, but that it's as old as the human race, as arguably the default way of governance and management and way of life, way of being. And so that's what's so fascinating today to see the parallelism between, for example, indigenous cultures and digital commons in the way that, I mean, obviously there's many significant differences, but there are many recurrent patterns as well and principles by which people come to organize themselves. And what I find fascinating is that the commons is kind of like a human challenge to neoliberalism and the premises of our prevailing economic system. And in a way, the commons is both apolitical in that it's about people wanting to protect the things they love and depend on for their everyday non-market life, as well as political because implicitly, if not explicitly, it critiques the prevailing economic system by offering an alternative worldview that's not just a white paper or a policy thing or abstract intellectualism, but a lived reality and social practice. And so, in a strange way, the commons is both particle and wave, apolitical and political, deeply human, but with ideological implication. But I quickly hasten to say that I don't think the commons is a ideology. It's not a buzzword or a way of rebranding the public interest or the common good. It really has some deep roots in ways of organizing social behaviors for governing and producing things. So it's not a totalistic worldview, nor entirely idiosyncratic, but it does, unlike a lot of previous ideologies or political movements, I really do think it has speaks to the internal, the subjective, the ways we interrelate to each other, the ways we interrelate to nature. And so to that extent, it extends from the ontological and the epistemological to the personal and social on up to the public policy and macroeconomics and politics. And it's precisely because it works on so many levels that I think it's such a rich, open-ended framework of inquiry as well as of political action. And currently I'm grappling with this right now because my co-author or co-editor Silke Helfrich and I are working on a new anthology of original essays with several dozen authors called Patterns of Commoning. And we're taking a cue from, for those of you know, the classic architecture text called A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. We take that as kind of a template for how I think we might understand the commons, in that there are these patterns of or sort of clusters of behavior that seem to indicate certain deep, almost maybe not even invented, but discovered ways of managing things. So that's one thing we're probing right now, and I'll just give you a quick list of a handful of the things we're looking at. We're doing both a series of profiles of successful, notable commons from all sorts of resource domains and geographic areas, as well as a deeper exploration of what would be the commons analog to Homo economicus. And so we're looking at really some deep personal, psychic, spiritual, ontological issues of what goes on when people common as a verb. So there's a whole idea of affective labor, meaning people bring of themselves and their identity and mix it with the resource, and we need to understand it in that way. Some of the commons that we look at are things like Farm Hack, which is an open source community that's developing all sorts of farm equipment that is on the principles of open source software, cheap, modular, locally sourceable, modifiable, and so forth. In a similar way, some of you may have heard of Arduino, which is a whole printed circuit boards for computers and electronic devices. All of it is open design and freely shareable and modifiable. Some of you may have heard of the Wiki Speed car, which is moving open source from simply software into design and production of real things in a more scalable way. A really fascinating development. But there's while the digital may be the most plastic and explosive in some ways in terms of innovation, it's important to remember that contrary to the tragedy of the commons thesis by Garrett Hardin, there's about 2 billion people in the world whose everyday subsistence needs are met through commons, be they forests or fisheries, farmland, irrigation water, wild game, and so forth. And I find it just so striking, if not scandalous, that conventional economics textbooks, introductory textbooks, virtually ignore this world because, of course, there's no market going on. There's no exchange of cash. There's no property right, private property rights, and so it's considered negligible or unimportant. Yet we're talking about a relatively ecologically benign way that lots of people meet their needs. Subsistence has been denigrated, by the way, as something that's sort of threadbare or survival. In many cases, it's simply non-market and needs to be validated and recognized more. But there's also lots of other commons, such as currencies, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but both digital currencies as well as things like the Bangla Pesa in Kenya, which has been this new currency that's helped a slum in Kenya revive itself by having tradable a currency that's not the fiat currency of the nation. And there's other things. I don't want to get too exhaustive, but I just want to give an idea of the scope. There's a crowdfunding website in Spain called Goteo, which is devoted exclusively to commons-based projects, raising capital and operating funds for them. So my point is there's just a huge diversity of such commons that really haven't been recognized as a class of behaviors and ways of managing important resources. So that's one thing that in my self-appointed mission I try to do, is try to make sense and bring together some of these phenomena which either have been neglected, they've been around for a while and neglected, or they're quite new and simply haven't been recognized properly. So let me move on to talking a little bit about the diversity of international activity that's going on around the commons. I suppose a couple of the major landmarks are this 2010 and a 2013 conference in Berlin hosted by the Heinrich Böll Foundation. And they brought more than 200 people of self-identified commoners to come together to explore different aspects of it. And I might add that these people are more of a activist or policy advocate or project leader practitioner type, as opposed to the Elinor Ostrom social scientist, which is not to say that they don't do important work, but it is an important dimension beyond the conventional academic study of the commons, which has both been remarkably important, but also, I think, in some respects, limited in describing some of these phenomena. There's also been all sorts of smaller activities, such as regional workshops of people who get together and essentially become networks of collaborators on a regional basis. We've had them in Asia and Latin America and Europe and elsewhere, all of which has convinced us that there is this broad international appeal. And that's kind of what's so interesting, is that the commons, by not being a totalizing monolithic critique, but more of a scaffolding or a meta critique and intellectual framework, allows it to be localized. And I've often used the metaphor of DNA, that scientists will tell you that DNA is underspecified precisely so it can adapt to local circumstances, which is why the human race can be so wildly diverse, yet still a single human race. And I think the commons is metaphorically, if not literally, the same thing. I just a little background on myself and why and how I'm doing this. I work with two colleagues, Silke Helfrich, who's a German activist, and Michel Bouwens, who runs the Peer-to-Peer Foundation. He's a Belgian who lives in Thailand, but is very active in Europe and even globally. And we call ourselves the Common Strategies Group. And we work independently. We're not even a legal entity, but we do try to start new conversations and bring different types of commoners together to cross-fertilize, make sense of, and then instigate new projects as possible. And besides the conferences that we've done with the Boll Foundation, we produced an anthology a couple years ago called The Wealth of the Commons, A World Beyond Market and State, which, by the way, is available online for free if you want to chase it down at wealthofthecommons.org. But you can also get print copies. And this was our attempt to try to show the enormous international diversity of commons activity, as well as different types of theoretical and political critiques. Again, going beyond the Ostrom International Association for the Study of Commons world, and in the sense that we are more overtly, unapologetically political in our assessment of the commons, as well as looking beyond the micro dimensions of the commons to the macro political and economic framing that often affects whether a commons can be successful or not. So that's kind of a nice framing document for the broader ambit of how we have tried to reconceptualize the commons. But let me move on to describing just what's going on in a handful of countries to give you an idea of specific things with some particularity. There's a number of commons festivals that have been held in different countries. Sweden last year held something called Pixelash, where they brought a lot of digital innovators together who were all focused on the commons. And it was a very exciting, robust conference. Another was the Commons Fest that occurred in Greece. Greece is fascinating because of the extreme austerity, sort of at the vanguard of neoliberalism. They have seen really the affirmative merits of peer production in digital spaces and the commons, and are quite active in developing it, to the extent that they've been in open conversations with Syriza, the leftist coalition, in terms of political and policy dimensions that might support the commons. Last year in Paris, there were about 5,000 people that attended the WeShare conference, which is focused mostly on the sharing economy, so-called, which is an interesting discussion in itself between the elements of the sharing economy that are subordinate to capitalist logic, and which arguably is more of a micro-rental economy than a sharing economy, and then the other more socially minded dimensions of the sharing economy, which see peer production and online platforms as a way to not only more efficiently do a lot of stuff, but to empower people and to allow communities to retain the value that they create, rather than it being siphoned away by capitalists. So, some really fascinating conversations going on there. This wasn't really a commons festival, but last 3 months ago, in Leipzig, Germany, there was the Dgrowth conference, which had a remarkable 3,000 people there. In some ways, it turned out to be, a lot about degrowth, so-called. I prefer post-growth, but it also was kind of a de facto movement congress for lots of adjacent movements, from the solidarity economy to cooperatives to commoners and so on. But I was quite struck by the energy as well as the younger demographic of the people who attended that. So I think there's a lot of ferment going on, but there's a lot of uncertainty about how this can manifest itself politically, especially in electoral politics. And I think there's a lot of thinking going on there, but that's, I think, a frontier people are trying to figure out how to move into. Perhaps Greece and Syriza will be a vanguard for that. Perhaps something else will erupt unexpectedly. But certainly one country that's been in the vanguard has been Italy. And this is partly because they had a major voter referendum on whether to privatize water several years ago. This was an initiative launched by Berlusconi when he was prime minister. And remarkably, the initiative was defeated by more than 90% of the vote. And because it was cast as whether water should remain a commons or not, at least by the opposition, the word commons started to go into mainstream political play. And people started to say, well, you know what, that's a commons too, and that's a commons. And it started to open up their minds politically and culturally to how they might think about certain issues of self-governance in Italy. So actually, a few months after the water referendum, there was an occupation of Tatro Valley, which is this venerable old theater in Rome that had, people like Mozart had played in centuries ago. And the protesters occupied it because the austerity budget and the city government was letting the place go to ruin and was not properly funding it or taking care of it. And not to mention, it was all serving more elite clienteles culturally. And the government proposed selling it off to private investors, and that was the last straw. So there was this occupation that lasted for 3 years. It just concluded in August, in which they negotiated a settlement with the city government to have a commons-based foundation in conjunction with the government, which is partly a face-saving move, act as the management and administrator of the theater. So this is kind of really a frontier experiment in commons-based governance of public facilities. In some ways, who is the more authoritative, legitimate manager of such resources? A government subject to a neoliberal regime that really doesn't have the money or would prefer to privatize it? Or people who care about the theater who are willing to engage in civil disobedience to try to protect it for the public and its use value? So the Tatro Valley episode itself was kind of a remarkable new landmark in Italian political action around the commons. But there are many other things going on in Italy too, such as in Naples, there's experiments with municipal, or call them public commons partnerships, where the city government can contract with private or with commons-based groups instead of private corporations, in which usually ends up giving away public assets for a huge discount, if not for free. There's also many academics in Italy, such as Ugo Mattei and Christian Aione, who are exploring such things as the city as a commons. How do we conceptualize the city as a commons, meaning resources that are essential to our flourishing as human beings ought to be not only accessible to us, but the policies ought to encourage our participation and responsibility towards those resources. So it's kind of a new conceptualization as opposed to, oh, the public bureaucracy will take care of us and we as passive citizens and consumers will just reap the benefits. And after all, we paid for it with our taxes. Well, thinking of the city as commons reconceptualizes what citizenship should be in arguably a more wholesome, active, and necessary form than the way we thought about it in the bureaucratic state in the 20th century. Quickly, I'll mention a few other countries. In Germany, partly because the Bold Foundation is there, partly because of the German culture, there's quite a flourishing, spontaneous commons movement. They recently founded a new Commons Institute to help promote things in different ways. There's been a summer school for the commons there. There's periodic conferences and workshops, and then more narrow issue activities as well. In the United States, I'm pleased to report just 2 weeks ago, there was, I think, a landmark conference hosted by the Omega Institute, which is a retreat center, spiritually oriented place north of New York City. And they had 500 people, more than 500 people, for a conference on the commons as commons, meaning it wasn't just a buzzword or a side issue. It was the issue of the conference, and they had such people as Vandana Shiva and Jeremy Rifkin and Bill McKibben, and I'm pleased to say myself. But I was extremely excited that the U.S. had this kind of resonance, because historically I found that the United States, as such a market individualistic country, is really quite uncomprehending or hostile, or perhaps sometimes indifferent to the commons. There's important pockets of commons activity in, say, water or digital commons, free software, local food, but often it's more of a secondary conceptualization and not the primary focus. So I'm really quite interested to see what evolves in the Hudson River Valley north of New York City, where there's quite a robust activist and artistic culture that seems to be embracing the commons. As one other, I'll name a couple other things going on internationally which suggest the scope and interest of commons activity. There's a number of mapping projects going on. One of them is called Transform Map, which is started in Germany and Austria, where a number of people are taking OpenStreetMap, the open source online map, and using it as a template to map not just commons, but all sorts of alternative economic projects, so that wherever you are in the world, you can start to identify interesting, diverse projects. They're still working on it, but they plan to launch it in March 2015. If any of you have any online mapping skills, you may want to get in touch with them, or get in touch with me, and I can put you in touch with them. My colleague Silke Helfrich is actively working on that. I think it could be enormous in terms of making the commons and alternative projects far more visible and accessible to people in a Wikipedia kind of way. So we'll see what emerges from that. In my own, I will proudly say that my own book, Think Like a Commoner, besides a French and Polish translation, is now being translated into Korean, Chinese, Italian, and Spanish, with a Hindi one talked about, but I don't know if it's serious. So I'm pleased, but I'm frankly taken aback a bit, because I didn't expect, certainly within 8-10 months of the publication of the book, that there would be such diverse international interest, but there is. Let's see. I won't talk about, let me just briefly mention, but I won't go into any great depth, the growing convergence and interest between the cooperative movement and the commons. Pat Conatee spoke there, I understand, a few days ago, and I'm sure he spoke about some of the activities that's going on. I'll mention one, though, that is notable, which is we had a workshop on what we're calling open cooperativism, which is an attempt to bring some of the participatory ethic and projects of open platforms and digital spaces into an active collaboration with the co-op movement, which many dimensions of it are rather stodgy or kind of quasi-corporations themselves without much of a participatory culture and ethic, let alone political presence in trying to advocate for the public good. So this is an attempt to try to find new practical projects by which digital commoners and co-ops might get together. They both need each other in the sense that the digital people have a lot of innovation, creativity, participation, but they don't have the resources or the institutional forms usually. Whereas the co-op movement does have that, including all sorts of financing, but arguably are not as robust, politically active, or innovative, or aware of non-market value, as opposed to simply being another competitor in the marketplace. So interesting stuff going on between cooperatives and the commons movement. I should mention a handful of digital commons because there's a lot of interesting developments there. I mean, originally, of course, online spaces were more proprietary in a conventional sense. Then they moved more to open platforms, which has given rise to the so-called sharing economy. But a lot of people, including myself, are starting to see we need to devise ways that the open platform is not simply cheap, raw feedstock for the usual capitalists, meaning communities have to be able to retain some of the value that they're creating themselves and not have it just being cherry-picked by investors and companies. Because sometimes an open platform is the equivalent of digital sharecropping, where you're working on the plantation owned by Facebook or Twitter or so forth. So in response to that, my colleague Michelle Bowens and others have helped develop what he calls a commons-based reciprocity license, which would allow you to license a community to license the content or information or designs or whatever else they're producing, so that anyone within their community or authorized commons or nonprofit communities could use the resource for free. But any commercial enterprise that wanted to use it for market purposes would have to pay. And this would be one way of those communities raising revenue, as well as protecting the integrity of their resources from simply becoming cheap production inputs for the market machine. So as you can see, a recurrent theme is trying to figure out a way to interrupt the logic of the conventional capital-driven markets and to find some sort of durable alternative framework, whether it's legal or technological or social, for asserting the logic of the commons in a durable, sustainable way. And I think the commons-based reciprocity license is a great example of that. There's going to be a fascinating debate at some point soon, if not already, within the sharing economy between those who are more conventionally capital-driven and want to see the sharing world as a way to make quick money on other people's efforts, Airbnb, Lyft, Uber, and so forth, versus the, let's call them proto-commoners, who really don't want to see that develop. I mean, a good case study is the transformation of couch surfing, which used to be this global hospitality travel site where you could, a gift economy, where you could stay on people's sofas or extra bedrooms for free, and they prohibited you from giving money to your host. But then they realized they needed more servers, more administration, more this and that, and they struck a deal with some venture capitalists. And slowly, they're becoming more of a consumer-driven travel service, because of course the investors want their due return and really aren't interested in a gift economy except as perhaps a PR veneer. So I think that's one of the major challenges is how commons can get adequate capital and management to maintain themselves as commons, as opposed to simply having to sell out once they reach a certain scale of success, and go into the standard capitalist logic. But I think it is safe to say there is a rather diverse, large common sector in digital spaces, which is not usually recognized as such because the focus is generally on who's making the most money and how much that IPO brought in. But if you think of everything from Creative Commons, now in 170 legal jurisdictions, Wikipedia with more than 70 or 80,000 active editors and these massive Wikimedia conferences, to open access publishing, scholarly publishing, there's more than 10,000 such journals, all of them bypassing commercial publishers and having Creative Commons licensed content. I mentioned open source software, but then the open design, hardware, and manufacturing sector from FarmHack and Wikispeed and Arduino and so forth is taking off too. The Fab Labs, the maker movement, a lot of the stuff that is documented by Jeremy Rifkin in his new book, The Zero Marginal Cost Society. This is like a really burgeoning area, and I think it's up for grabs about whether the old capitalist logic will rein it in and try to impose its artificial scarcity regime, or whether commoners will be able to devise their own structures, financing mechanisms, legal protections to maintain them as commons. So a fascinating development. But a related development, which again is fascinating, is the whole Bitcoin phenomena. And I don't want to get into that too deeply, except to say, don't think that it's just a libertarian speculative vehicle. The technology that undergirds Bitcoin, the so-called blockchain ledger, which allows for basically verification of transactions without a third-party guarantor like the government or banks, is a remarkable innovation, meaning you can do a transaction and the blockchain ledger basically acts as an audit trail available to everybody who's part of the system for you to do a reliable transaction and know that the other person is not counterfeiting the money digitally or some other way. Well, this has enormous, first of all, as a proof of concept, has enormous implications because it opens the door conceptually and technologically for distributed systems of trust, where you can use the blockchain ledger for communities to verify transactions, as well as there's related movements to have distributed authenticated identity, meaning you don't have Facebook or Twitter authenticating who you are. You can do it yourself as a community and sort of turn Facebook inside out, where a community devises its own network and has the technological means to verify and authenticate who you're dealing with so that serious resources can be shared reliably in a trustworthy way. Well, this is still at the dawn of that, but I think that's where it's going. I recently co-edited a book of an anthology of essays on this, which you can download for free if you Google it. It's called From Bitcoin to Burning Man and Beyond: The Quest for Identity and Autonomy in a Digital Society. It's about 15 essays. And it explores some of these issues of distributed governance and how in some ways the technology is solving many of the age-old collective action problems, at least in a digital context. So there's one of the more hopeful signs. Well, there's a couple things spinning off from this. One is the idea of distributed autonomous organizations, where you can have organizations that are not centralized in the standard bureaucratic or NGO way, but are totally peer-based, yet they're sustainable because you know who you're dealing with and you can authenticate them and you can start to collaborate common style on them. One experiment in this regard is there's a Catalonian-based cooperative called Catalunya Integral Cooperativa, CIC, which is adapting some of this technology to create what their own digital currency called Faircoin. And they, Catalonians, of course, don't especially like the Spanish government, and they're, especially in these times of austerity, don't think they can trust the state to provide for their needs. So they see this digital currency as a potential global currency among friendly cooperatives for retaining value that those cooperative members have created. So an interesting currency challenge to traditional fiat currency. There will undoubtedly be legal implications and difficulties along the way. Unclear if the technology will outpace that or not, but again, a kind of a fascinating development. Let me just, a few more things and then I'll just stop and we'll open it up for questions. I think I want to point to a real important need for legal innovation to affirmatively protect commons. I've sort of alluded to this along the way here, but in the way that the general public license for free software was indispensable for the rise of free software, open source software, and Linux, and the Creative Commons license licenses for making shareable content legal, which was extremely difficult under conventional copyright. I think we need similar types of legal innovation today. I sort of ventured into this world, not just in the tech area, but in environmental area. I did a book with a colleague, Burns Weston, who's an international human rights scholar, called Green Governance, Ecological Survival, Human Rights, and the Law of the Commons. And we wanted to recover from history various fragments of what we regard as commons-based law and suggest how it constitutes a tradition and something that should be revived and revamped in more expansive ways. For example, there's something called the public trust doctrine that guarantees the public access and protection of certain resources that the state is prohibited from giving away or selling off, such as beaches and oceans and things like that. It's currently being used in litigation called the atmospheric trust litigation, ATL, where they're invoking the public trust doctrine to try to stop, in the United States, state governments and the federal government from destroying the atmosphere by allowing too much carbon to be released, saying that the government has an affirmative obligation to protect this common resource under the public trust doctrine. So that's one example of how, at a both practical nitty-gritty level, we need to think about legal innovations, as well as these other more experimental ones. The problem is the modern liberal state is philosophically, one might even say constitutionally hostile to commons-based law, because it is so focused on individual rights and individual property rights that it literally almost cannot comprehend collective rights or interests, except for, of course, corporations. So there's a real challenge in devising things that within the existing state systems can legally work and be enforceable. But as we've seen with the GPL and CC licenses, as well as others, there are possibilities. But beyond that, we need to, I think, even have more visionary proposals for what law should be like that protects the commons. I mean, I've come up with the notion, drawing upon Ivan Illich, the dissident sociologist critic, of vernacular law, meaning certain communities, through their informal law, ought to have some recognition for that, that custom and informally negotiated forms of law deserve certain types of standing. It gets tricky because not all commons are benign. There are certain kinds of very pernicious tribalisms, which many of which the state should intervene with. So I think there's a discussion we need to have about how state-based law, which is so deeply entwined with market principles, needs to be reformed, reconceptualized somehow to take account of commons-based law and vernacular law. I think unless it does, it's hopeless in dealing with climate change. We need to find some way to break the grip of what I call the market-state duopoly, and all of which is enforced by its system of law. So a big challenge there. So let me just close by saying I don't think it's just about legal forms or organizational forms, important as those are. I think it's also about social behaviors, practices, and values. The great commons historian Peter Linebaugh has said, there is no commons without commoning, meaning the commons is a verb. And I think we need to pay attention to that, because otherwise the danger is that the objectified words and concepts can be too easily co-opted, take on different meanings, become totalistic. And I think ultimately it's the human activity, the presence of humans with each other that needs to be respected and validated in new ways, particularly with law. And I think that this has, in an indirect but powerful way, great subversive potential, because if you look at creating these alternative centers of gravity, both morally and economically, uh, they start to monkey wrench the system. The way that Linux forced Microsoft and the rest of the software industry to reconceptualize and come back at open source software in new ways. It changed the whole nature of the marketplace. The same way that local food, slow food, CSAs, and these other food-based alternatives have, in their slow way, changed things far more than any frontal attack on public policy could have. And they never could have in the first place because it's so difficult to rally citizens to succeed in those rigged arenas. And I think the Occupy movement and the indignados and the riots or the protests in Istanbul and the rest are all cultural expressions of trying to find new frameworks, institutional frameworks for getting beyond the systemic impasse or dysfunction that we're in right now. And I happen to think that the Commons has a lot of potential in growing those new forms. They're still rather embryonic in many cases, but they have a different logic that is protectable and durable and evolvable, which I think is more than you can say for many of the conventional forms of liberal activism, which, I'm glad they're there, my liberal activist friends, but I also think there are distinct limits to what can be achieved, and often it's simply a rearguard action within the conventional policy venue. And after the elections in the U.S. yesterday, nothing's going to happen for the next 2 years. So where do you want to put your energies? I think we need to start to build some new vehicles because there's already a lot of people out there, and you don't need any special expertise. You just need a commitment and an understanding of this different logic and worldview, and enough people to start to develop a project. And that's actually kind of one of the more hopeful things you can realize, that it's not so far away. It's right in your own backyard, but you need to have certain clarity about what can be achieved, what can be aspired to. So that's my quick overview of, I think, a lot of the developments going on in the Commons world today, but I'd love to take some questions. Michelle Bowens spent about 9 months in Ecuador working with an academic group that had been commissioned by the Ecuador government to develop a new framework for a policy framework for promoting peer production, particularly in a developing country. And this was called the FLOK project, FLOK, F-L-O-K, standing for Free, Libre, Open Knowledge project. And Michel and his colleagues came away with a rather detailed framework for by which a state could support and foster peer production as a legal matter, as something that could contribute affirmatively to their economy. And while the project had, in its end stage last year in Ecuador, or actually, I'm sorry, earlier this year, ran into all sorts of political complications, the framework is there, and Michelle has been visiting a number of countries, particularly in Europe, some of whom are interested in it. I know that there's people in Catalonia who think it's a terrific framework, and so that's something worth exploring some more. Again, it's a kind of frontier in terms of thinking how policy can promote the commons. And I have enormous admiration for Ivan Illich and that sensibility of technologies getting out of control and not being convivial, being capturable, being a source of domination, being a source of additional cost and human suffering. At the same time, we're born into a going world, and these technologies exist and do frame and dominate our life. And I'm not sure if retreating from them is necessarily going to be a solution. Maybe for the Zapatistas, who are kind of quasi-isolationist, it has worked, and I admire that approach. But in some ways, we've got to tame these technologies because we're not going to be able to banish them. They are too integrated into the economy and arguably into our lives. I think in some ways we need to find ways to use the technology to serve larger purposes without being captured. Now, maybe that's impossible. Maybe that's a paradox, and maybe Illich and Gustavo should have the last word on that, which is why I say I have a complicated reaction, because I fully understand how technologies beyond our understanding and scope and power can have all these very nasty impacts on our lives. But having said that, I'm not sure what the response is to certain ubiquitous technologies that are instruments of power over our lives. Retreating or walling them off, I don't think is a credible option for many things. So I think sometimes we just have to get in there and redesign them to serve our purposes, the way, for example, the Transform Map project is using OpenStreetMap. So I guess that's my complicated, unsatisfactory response. We're heading towards a world in which social community and markets are starting to overlap, if not coincide, meaning the social foundation of markets, which most economics denies or ignores, is asserting itself such that you, at least in the online world, you cannot have markets without paying keen attention to the social dimensions of the community. And if you piss them off too much, they're going to go somewhere else. Well, that's a whole dimension that standard economics just doesn't want to venture into, because they consider the social dimension just uniform or exogenous factors. But now that certain we start to see that markets are a subset of commons in which we happen to say, well, the terms of exchange will be on money and private property rights in this commons, as opposed to non-market collective rights. So I think the commons, or the market, is a kind of significant subset of the commons that is maybe more hyper-developed than it should be. But in any case, we're starting to see the social dimensions of markets asserting themselves.
Thanks, David, for the work you're doing and for sharing it with us.
Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks.